Woodhouse, City Manager for the City of Pacifica. I'm going to make a couple introductory comments and the all-important aspect of some housekeeping aspects of this meeting. First, thank you so much for taking your time to be here. Please grab dinner if you haven't already. Grab seconds if you've already had dinner. There's probably plenty of food. Amazing turnout tonight, and I'm glad that the weather sort of cooperated with us earlier this morning. It was coming down pretty hard. I'd like to, before I begin, introduce Mayor Mary Beer is here. Where's Mary right now? There's Mayor Beer. And Mayor Pro Tem Tiger Jazz Big Stick is here as well. And I just want to point out that the 2 council members are here while all 5 council members are very interested in this topic. The Brown Act conversations tonight, they will not be participating in the conversation, so I just want to point that out, that's why they're wandering around and listening to the table conversations. Couple housekeeping items. Did I mention dinner? How was it anyways? Good? All right, great. Yes. Bathrooms are through these doors here. One particular detail, at least about the men's bathroom, is that when you exit from it, make sure that that little lock thing pops out, because otherwise it's going to be permanently locked. Appreciate that. I did also want to mention, well, there's exit signs on both ends, and at each table there will be survey forms at the end of the meeting if you could take the couple minutes that it takes to fill out the survey form and leave it with the facilitator that will be at your table. I'll greatly appreciate that. So again, this conversation about housing in Pacifica is vital to Pacifica now, it's vital to Pacifica in the near future, and it's vital to Pacifica in the long term. So thank you for being here to provide input and taking your time to do that. And I want to introduce Christian Murdoch, Planning Director, now to take it away.
Thank you, Kevin, and good evening, everybody. My name is Christian Murdoch. I am the Planning Director for the City of Pacifica. I have the pleasure of being the one to help guide you through the first part of tonight's meeting. You may be wondering, why are we here? And part of that answer is to make sure you understand more about the city's housing element update process. And tonight we're going to try to take you through 4 main areas of focus: an introduction to the housing element update and process for the update, an explanation of the City of Pacifica's Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA, which is really the focus of tonight's discussion, strategies to plan for the RHNA, and then to receive your feedback on what those strategies suggest in terms of an approach to meeting the city's housing planning obligations. Before we do that, I want to take a moment, maybe 2 minutes, to have you at each table turn to the person to the left and the right of you, introduce yourself, share your name, tell them how long you've lived in Pacifica, and just let's warm up the room and make it a very inviting and family-oriented process. All right. Hopefully you all had a chance to meet somebody new or to learn something about someone you know that you didn't know before tonight. So thank you. So let's get right into the program for tonight. What is a housing element, which is what we're talking about, right? You're here to talk about housing through the lens of the city's housing element update process. To start, the housing element is part of the city's general plan. The general plan is the guiding document required by state law, has a number of required components like planning for land use and other factors that guide the city's long-term investments, long-term decision making, and one of those required elements is, of course, the housing element. It includes an analysis of housing needs, an evaluation of constraints, including scarcity of land, land prices, city policies and regulations, and so on that constrain the production, approval, and construction of housing. It includes a mandatory identification of sites where the city's housing obligations, or RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, can be identified on particular sites and sites sufficient to build enough housing units to build the RHNA. It includes goals, policies, programs, and other objectives that guide the city's decision-making and policies with respect to housing. And it has a special focus on fair housing, environmental justice, and community input. In other words, hearing from you, our community. Tonight, our focus is on identification of sites to meet the needs of the RHNA and the strategies the city can use to identify specific sites, which we'll get into more in a few moments. And so in terms of a process, really it's the foundational component of it is the community input, because we need to have a plan that incorporates our community's values and something that we can ultimately get the City Council's support to approve. It also includes that analysis I mentioned of the city's policies and programs, and a bunch of technical information, studies about population projections, jobs projections, the different types of housing needs, changes in household size, and other demographics that all feed into the city's analysis to help us meet our objectives. Those are written into a draft document. That document goes through a public review and comment process, and then ultimately goes to the state where they review and identify if the document complies with the requirements of state law. And then it comes back to the City Council at the end of that process for final adoption, at which point it becomes part of the general plan and then guides the city's actions and decision-making through the 8-year planning period. And so the city has an obligation under state law to update its housing element every 8 years. The city last adopted its housing element in 2015, and so in 2023, we have an obligation to update our housing element for the next 8-year period, covering 2023 through 2031. And so as you can imagine, having to take all of those factors into account, an update of the housing element is a pretty involved process. It takes a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of community input. And so we started our process in August of this year when we went to the City Council to outline our community engagement strategy to bring the folks together just like we are in the room tonight, and using other tools and techniques and methods to seek community input, including online surveys and so on. At that August meeting, the City Council, in fact, identified that it wanted more outreach. And so we had proposed 2 community meetings, for example, and the City Council said, let's do 3. And the City Council at that time also identified they wanted a citywide mailer to make sure every resident had an opportunity to hear about this important community planning process. And so after getting that confirmation, we launched our process in September. We had our first community meeting using an online virtual meeting. Many of you were there. We've also done pop-up outreach, such as at the Pacifica Farmers Market and elsewhere, and have engaged many community stakeholder organizations and individuals to try to help get the word out about this process that we're undertaking. And so in terms of key steps, we're somewhere in the middle of this process. We are gathering additional community input and feedback. We had a meeting last week. We're having another meeting tonight, of course. And we're continuing to seek input through surveys and other methods to see if the concepts and the strategies we're using to achieve our housing element objectives resonate with you. As you'll hear more about in a minute, we have a really tall task to undertake in terms of planning for housing for this particular community housing element update process. And we do need all of the ideas and all of the input we can get in order to figure out how we're going to fulfill our obligations. And so we're going through that process now. It's going to culminate early next year in the city's release of a draft housing element document. We will release that for a public review and comment period where you can tell us if we got it right or not. And so we are trying to do our best, given the tight time constraints for this process to play out, to make sure we're hearing from you as robustly as we can and also taking into account the feedback that other communities in our area are receiving on their housing elements. So hopefully we can get through the state's review process the first time around. Following that review and comment period early next year, we will send our document, as mentioned, to the California Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD. You're going to hear that agency more than once tonight. They have the obligation under state law to review every community's draft housing element to determine if it complies with the requirements in state law to plan for housing of all types and for all income levels. And so what they will do in a 60 or 90-day period typically is go through the draft housing element with a fine-toothed comb and determine whether or not it substantially complies with state law. And that's the key objective that we have in preparing our housing element, to substantially comply with all of the various legal requirements that the state legislature has said must be within a community's housing element. And so it's a challenging process. Some communities in our area have received 15, 20-page letters, line by line, bulletized feedback in terms of what doesn't comply that they have to go back and work on. And so we're trying to incorporate all of that into the best draft that we can prepare in the beginning. And then, as mentioned, we will culminate hopefully in the middle of next year with an adoption of that substantially compliant housing element by our city council, and then have it be part of our general plan. So the key takeaways for what's known as the Cycle 6 or sixth cycle RENA update is that the RENA is increasing. And so many of you have probably seen the numbers. Our RENA, as compared to 2015, is about 5 times larger than it was then. And so just the challenge of planning for that many more housing units in Pacifica is great. There will also be increased scrutiny by HCD, that state agency that's obligated to review local government's housing elements. They are looking very carefully to make sure that we have not only complied with the letter of the law, but also the spirit of the law. We are also going to be subject to additional review through affirmatively furthering fair housing, which I'll talk more about in a moment. But in other words, in simple terms, not increasing segregation with our housing decisions, not putting all of the lower income housing in one part of town, making sure it's spread out, making sure it's located in areas with good access to education, jobs, services, etc. And then lastly, in terms of the big picture points, the key number for our process is 30 units per acre, which we've said here is the magic number, right? And what that means, 30 dwelling units per acre, given our city and where we fall within the criteria in state law, in order to, by default, consider a particular housing site as eligible for constructing affordable housing, it needs to have a density of at least 30 dwelling units per acre. And so that is much denser than a lot of the housing that's been built and approved in Pacifica over the last 40 years. And so it's going to require us to think outside the box in terms of where those types of housing sites should be located and the appropriate density, knowing that 30 units per acre is the floor, and are there places where we may want to go higher than 30 units per acre to achieve other community objectives. So we've talked a lot about the RENA so far, but what does that really mean visualized? And as you'll see right now, 2 charts. The chart on your left is the 5th cycle, or 2015 through 2023, our current housing element, 413 total units of housing that Pacifica had to plan for. Positioned next to our 6th cycle RENA for 2023 through 2031, requiring 1,892 units of housing. And within that, a significant proportion of that, 60%, for lower moderate income levels, which we'll talk more about in a moment, has the greatest number of challenges and restrictions on where the city can identify appropriate sites for those income levels. So we're not starting from scratch, thankfully, in trying to receive your input and your feedback on housing-related issues. In 2019, the city undertook what's known as the Home for All process, where we had 2 community conversations in town about housing and how housing is affecting our community, the challenges people are having with housing, and what, if anything, they want done about it. And so, as we look back at that feedback, I took three community statements from that process that really stuck with me. The first is someone that said, "I'm losing the ability to continue to live in the community I grew up in with the people I grew up with. I want to stay, but I can't." Another person said, "We pay more than 50% of net income for rent and probably can't hold on much longer." And the one that stuck with me as a parent of 2 young children is someone said, my children can't afford to stay here. And so that really hit me, because you spend all this time trying to bring them up in this community that you love and that we all love, only to have them unable to come back and raise their own families here because of the cost and unavailability of housing. And so those are impressions, on the city staff, and I'm sure many of you have experienced similar circumstances yourselves or with people that you care about. Another point of input from the community that we've continued to document and take into account for our planning processes were through the general plan update and the Sharp Park specific plan processes in 2019 through 2022. And so all of this feedback we've received to present has really fallen into some key concerns and some key community values. And so what we've heard consistently from the community with respect to building more housing is that we're concerned about transportation-related issues, traffic, and parking. And we've also heard concerns about wanting to increase vibrancy, wanting housing to be put in places and constructed in such a way as to improve walkability, to enhance the arts, and to provide more activities for our community, for ourselves, and for our children. We also heard common values which resonated throughout the variety of community input processes we've had to date. People are concerned about retaining Pacifica's small town feel. It's something that's really important and that everybody values. They want to preserve the coastal environment, protect the open spaces, protect hillsides, improve walkability, as mentioned on the concerns as well, enhance our diversity, different races, different ages, different income levels, and also provide housing for all incomes and all ages. And so these are values that have resonated throughout the process and that we've used to inform our decision making thus far in the housing element update process. That community process through Home for All has also yielded certain housing strategies that the city, or that the community rather, has said they could support and that they wanted the city to explore further in its work on housing. Those are, on the left side of your screen, mixed-use development, infill development, workforce housing, affordable housing, senior housing, and accessory dwelling units. And the discussion we're going to have tonight with the strategies that we've identified so far will support all of these various types of housing that the community previously has said are appropriate for Pacifica if done in the right way. The community previously also expressed its support for duplex, triplex, and fourplex development. In other words, a site where a single-family residence is located, enabling people to build 2, 3, or 4 units there rather than just one home. We've not prepared our conversation tonight to really carry that on because the state has adopted a law called SB 9, which largely accomplishes that objective in terms of providing a framework within which individual single-family homeowners can construct duplex, triplex, or fourplex subject to the requirements of that law and the local zoning process. So it's important, but we're not going to focus on it because there's already a strategy in place for that. The community also expressed a desire for tiny homes. That is a strategy that we've identified some legal and regulatory obstacles to, and also it's not likely to yield the number of units, just given the type of development that it is. It's probably not a strategy that's going to get us to our goal of nearly 2,000 housing units. So we are not planning to talk about that further tonight. And then the last two types of housing that were identified by the community previously, home sharing and co-housing, those are related to how you use existing housing. They're not strategies for the production of new housing. And so with respect to our obligations to plan for more housing units, these aren't particularly housing types or strategies that we're going to use to help us get to our objective. So as we're thinking about this enormous task that we have as a community to plan for nearly 2,000 housing units or more, there are some limitations on the assumptions that we can use to identify those sites. I'm going to talk about a number of those limitations and assumptions tonight. The first is historical development trends that need to inform a realistic housing density. It was in the past a process the city could undertake where it would say, here's a site, let's just say a 1-acre site. It allows 20 dwelling units per acre. Therefore, we assume 20 housing units will be built for our housing element and then move on to the next site. What the state has realized is that's not a realistic assumption. Most projects aren't coming in at 100% of their allowable density or the maximum density. And as a result, the city needs to use realistic assumptions about how many housing units will be developed on a site that allows a particular density range. And so based on our, I think roughly 5 years was included in our calculation, our average of housing unit approvals, that was 81% of maximum density. And so that's the assumption that we're using for our planning purposes. So in other words, if you have that 1 acre site and it allows 30 dwelling units per acre, we're assuming roughly 24 units will be constructed. And so we can't use 100% of the site's capacity when adding to our planning obligations. The next assumption and limitation is related to lower income housing. So that is more than half of our planning obligation, and that is also the most highly regulated and most restrictive type of housing that the city has to plan for. And so what the state has said in its regulations guiding our process is that you need to identify sites that are larger than a half an acre, but less than 10 acres in size. And so in Pacifica, as we all know, a lot of our infill sites that we'd really like to focus housing on, they're much smaller than a half an acre, and so they're not by default suitable to assume for our lower income housing planning purposes. Fortunately, we don't have many sites that are larger than 10 acres, other than the hillside sites, which we'll talk about later. And so therefore, I think really the focus is on finding those sites that are larger than a half an acre, but probably in the 2 to 5 acre size range. We also, as mentioned earlier, need to assume that those sites are zoned for 30 dwelling units per acre or more, so that they qualify as a lower income housing site. And then additionally, the state will subject our housing site identification to additional scrutiny if more than half of our lower income housing sites in the housing element are non-vacant. In other words, they have some form of development on them already. Given our history of development in town and the protection of large swaths of open space, we don't have a lot of vacant sites available to begin with. And many of those sites are hillside sites or open space sites that we want to protect, and we don't want to prioritize for housing. And so that will put our housing element through a higher process of scrutiny by the state. And so that's another level that we have to think about when putting together our assumptions for which sites to include. In terms of accessory dwelling units, that is a strategy and a housing type that's come up over and over from the community as one that most people, or many people at least, can support. Adding one unit where there's already a unit, a single family residence, perhaps isn't seen as impactful to the community as maybe building an apartment building. That is feedback that is very sensible, and I understand it, but the state has said, we're going to put limits on how many accessory dwelling units you can assume towards your planning obligation, towards the RENA. And so what that means for us is looking at a 4-year average of actual accessory dwelling unit approvals in Pacifica. And for us, that totals about 161 accessory dwelling units over the 8-year planning period. So that's a little bit less than 10% of our overall planning obligation. And so I just want to be clear tonight, we're not going to be able to use ADUs for 50% or 75% or 100% of our RENA. We are going to need to find other housing strategies. The next assumption and limitation on our process is in the coastal zone. An important part of our community, west of Highway 1, is located in the coastal zone, which means there is an interface with the California Coastal Commission. And those that have worked with the Coastal Commission or that are familiar with the process will understand that they have a rigorous review process, and they have different assumptions that they'll use in terms of development capacity and suitability. And so really the most important thing, sort of as a high-level planning consideration, is making sure that if we're looking to add more housing or increase the allowable density on a site, that it's outside of a coastal hazard zone, because there are restrictions on increasing the density and intensity of development where a site might be subject to sea level rise or coastal erosion or flooding or other coastal hazards. And so that's going to eliminate a number of potential housing sites that are typically most closely located to the ocean. And then the last one on this slide is called no net loss. And that's sort of a wonky term, but what that means is in the future, once the city has identified housing sites in the housing element and an actual project comes through, if it comes through with fewer units than the city had assumed in the housing element for that site, the city, if it approves the project, needs to make sure that that's not going to cause our housing site inventory to drop below our planning obligation in the housing element. And so the best way to protect against that is to have a buffer on top of our RENA. And the state guidelines suggest somewhere between 15 and 30% above our minimum planning obligation. So if we have a RENA of 1,892 units, we would need to plan for anywhere between 284 and 568 additional buffer units on top of that. And so you can see, while our obligation is, less than 2,000, in reality, the practical implication is we need to plan for more than 2,000 units of housing across those various income levels. And then on this slide, and we'll take a couple slides to talk about this, a new consideration in this housing element update process is affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH. And so there's a lengthy definition in state law, but again, what it boils down to is taking meaningful actions to combat discrimination, particularly racial discrimination, and undoing, the sad and tragic history of institutionalized discrimination in housing. Many of you have heard of redlining and so forth, and those decisions have propagated over time, right, to create a lot of segregated neighborhoods in the Bay Area and elsewhere in the state. And so we need to make sure that our housing planning process is not going to compound or continue or exacerbate those historical trends. And so that's another dimension that the state will be using to review our housing decision making. And so it's something that we need to be mindful of at the outset as an assumption. And so we have some tools to help guide us through that, and I'll show you a couple examples of that. So the types of considerations that will be used, for example, this is a map showing lower diversity to higher diversity areas. The lighter sort of yellow-green color is lower diversity up to the darkest green of higher diversity. And you can see based on census tracts and block groups that we have varying areas of diversity in Pacifica. And so that is going to be an indicator for the state in looking at our housing decisions to make sure that we're not intentionally putting them in particular areas based on race. This is another variation of that. This map depicts white majority census tracts. And so you can again see that from the north end of town to the southern end of town, we have varying areas of racial diversity. And so this is the type of analysis that the state will use to determine whether they're seeing any indication or pattern of the city putting lower income housing in areas that may be disadvantaged or already highly segregated in such a way that it would run counter to the AFFH principles. And so what we've done in trying to take all of that community feedback in terms of values, in terms of your concerns, in terms of your desires for housing types, and the limitations and constraints in state law is to try to come up with a number of strategies that we can use at a high level to guide our planning and our decision making in this housing element update process. And so we've identified 6 strategies that we want to talk about tonight and to really hear your thoughts about. They're on the screen right now. They're in the handouts, and your facilitators at each table, when we have a breakout in a moment, they're going to guide you through those questions and those strategies to help get your feedback on them. But what I'm going to do before we do that is take you through examples of each of those strategies to try to help you understand what it is the city's getting at with each of those strategies and how big of a role we think it can play in reaching our planning obligations. And so before we get into these examples, I do want to add a disclaimer that including a particular property in the slides tonight does not suggest that the property owner necessarily is supportive of identification as a housing site in the housing element. And so this is simply for illustrative purposes only. I do also want to highlight the fact that as you'll see, individual properties and housing numbers on each of these slides, that's an example site for a larger strategy that encompasses a number of other sites. And so the city is preparing, draft lists internally of what those sites could be based on these strategies. But the slides tonight and the handouts that you have before you are 1 or 2 of those sites that are consistent with those strategies, not all of the units being located on those 1 or 2 sites. So I just want to make sure that's very clear. So the first strategy that we've identified is the 2040 General Plan strategy. And what that means is the City Council adopted a comprehensive general plan update in July of this year, replacing the 1980 general plan, that's right, 1980 general plan, with the 2040 general plan that will take us through the next 20 years of decision-making and land use planning in Pacifica. And so a number of sites in that housing element were either redesignated to allow housing or mixed-use development with commercial and housing, or already allowed housing but were redesignated to allow denser housing. up to 30 units or 50 units per acre in some instances. And one other key assumption, which I should have mentioned a moment ago, is all these calculations and assumptions tonight on these example slides are based on that 30 dwelling unit per acre number. And so thinking of our largest planning challenge being for low and moderate income, we're using that 30 dwelling units per acre to show you the floor at which we have to plan and to consider, are there opportunities or appropriate places or locations to increase density in a way that might provide a helpful trade-off or to help us close the gap, which we'll talk about. So for this example strategy, this is the Park Mall Shopping Center in Park Pacifica at Terra Nova and Ottstadt. The overall site is a little under 6 acres. We've identified about 2 acres that might be suitable for new housing or redeveloped use of the existing site, primarily parking lot areas, but a small undeveloped dirt lot as well. The current general plan, the 2040 general plan, identifies what's known as mixed-use neighborhood, and that allows commercial and housing up to 30 dwelling units per acre on this site. And so the potential for this site, with the areas we've identified, is roughly 46 dwelling units. And so what this does is it says, here's basically the baseline that we have in terms of the city's land use regulations. Let's use sites, let's identify the appropriate portions of those sites that might be suitable for housing and figure out how many housing units we can get with what we already have. And so using that strategy, we can get, we believe, roughly 22% of our RHNA. And so it's a good starting point to consider the other strategies. What that means is 78% of our RHNA will come from new decision making that's not currently in our general plan. The next strategy that we talked about or have identified, accessory dwelling units. As mentioned earlier, we have to take an average, in this case 2018 through 2021, multiply that per year average of approved ADUs, multiply it times the 8 years of the housing element planning period, and we're allowed to count 161 ADUs towards our RHNA. And so using that particular housing strategy, we can get 8.5% of our RHNA. The next strategy, we've heard a lot of community support for redeveloping existing shopping centers and commercial areas. In this example, we've identified some portions of the Lindemar Shopping Center, again, parking lot areas that are not currently constructed with buildings. Of the overall 12.5 acre site, this example shows 4.6 acres. In the current general plan, it's designated as retail commercial, which doesn't allow housing. And so if we were to apply the mixed-use neighborhood designation, which we talked about for Park Mall Shopping Center, we could get perhaps up to 112 housing units. Or with the denser mixed-use center, which allows up to 50 dwelling units per acre, we could get 186 housing units. And so what this approach does is it seeks to identify underutilized portions of existing shopping centers to determine if there is a potentially feasible way to construct housing on those portions that are not already developed. Other communities are in the position where they have underperforming shopping centers, perhaps with a lot of vacancies or other deferred or degraded maintenance and structural issues, where they can make a good case that those shopping centers are likely to redevelop in their entirety, and they can use more of that land area. We're, I guess, blessed in the sense that we have mostly well-performing shopping centers. Even though many of them are older, they don't have as many vacancies as they would need in order for us to count larger portions of those shopping centers towards our housing element. And so using this strategy in terms of shopping centers and commercial areas, we believe we can identify up to 13% of our RHNA. The next strategy was public property sites. And so this is, I think, one of the unique strategies in the sense that some public areas and agencies have large acreage that they own. So in this example of Oceana High School, the overall site is 51 acres. And we've identified 7.5 acres of that site that are likely to meet the criteria for inclusion in the housing element as a housing site. That development potential between 30 dwelling units per acre and 50 dwelling units per acre would allow between 182 and 303 dwelling units on those identified portions. In this instance here, this is the City of Pacifica's Corporation Yard at Milagro and Oceana. And this site is relatively small compared to the other public site at Oceana High School. It's less than an acre. It's 0.81 acres in total. And this site could yield anywhere between 20 and 33 dwelling units, and in this case, assuming full redevelopment of the site. And so using public property sites that we've identified, we believe up to 25% of our arena could be satisfied. And so you'll see this is the largest of the strategies that we've identified, and it's one of the most important, and so it's one that really will need a lot of community feedback on. The other strategy we identified is Caltrans opportunity sites. In this instance, we've identified a portion of Skyline Boulevard, just south and west of the intersection with Hickey Boulevard. The overall area in question is a little over 9 acres, but we've identified a roughly 5-acre portion which is uniquely situated in that it's next to the villages at Pacifica, formerly the Marymount apartment complex, that has been taken over by an affordable housing developer. And they've actually expressed interest in seeing if they can acquire that property from Caltrans and get city approval to construct housing. So we decided to use that area as our example site, given it's immediately next to that existing affordable housing development. And the development potential of that portion of the Caltrans right-of-way is 122 to 203 dwelling units. And so using the Caltrans opportunity sites strategy, we believe we can provide a little over 6% of the RENA. And then using the coastal zone strategy, which is to find sites that are outside of the coastal hazard zones and that might otherwise be suitable for housing. This example of the strategy is the Ace Shopping Center, or Ace Hardware area rather, on San Pedro Avenue in Pedro Point. The overall site is about 2.2 acres. In this instance, we assumed redevelopment of the entire site, and it could yield anywhere between 53 and 89 dwelling units under this scenario. And the use of appropriate sites in the coastal zone outside of coastal hazard areas could yield about 11% of our RENA. And so the culmination of these 6 strategies, starting with what's already in our general plan and applying the 5 other strategies I outlined, what that yields is 86% of our RENA, which is a great start in terms of having this conversation. But what that means below the surface is that 55% of those require what's known as rezoning. In other words, changing the general plan and or zoning to allow housing. And so what that means is a very heavy lift in terms of decision making for the community and for the city council. And we need, beyond that 86% we've identified with our 6 strategies already, there's still a gap that we haven't been able to close at the city staff level, taking into account the community values you've provided to us and the strategies that we've been able to identify on our own. And so what that means is, as a starting point as a community, we need to identify at least 265 housing units and potentially more depending on your feedback on those strategies that we've identified for you. So that's the starting point for our conversation tonight. Beyond that, as I mentioned earlier, we have this need to address our no net loss considerations, or in other words, the buffer on top of our RENA. And so the 15% buffer would be another 284 units, and a 30% buffer would be another 568 housing units. And so I've heard I heard the grumbles from some of you. It's clear that it's an enormous planning challenge for our community. And so that's why we are gathered here tonight, to try to get your input and your insights so we can bring your creativity, your thoughts, your values, and your reactions to these strategies to accomplish our planning goal. Because the reality of this situation is we're not able to say no. We can't say we don't want to do it. We've received this allocation. There's no opportunity to appeal or to challenge or to reject it. And so our task as a community is to figure out how are we going to be successful in this process. And so we are at this point preparing to break into our small group discussions. Before we do that, I do want to make sure you're aware of some ground rules. So tonight we need to be respectful of one another, and we ask you to speak from your own experience. So we all have different opinions, different backgrounds. Speak the truth as you know it, but please limit it to your experience and your opinion. Be sure to listen to understand from each other as well. So you may come in with your own set of experiences and opinions, but you may learn something from someone else if you'll give yourself that opportunity to listen. Also, respect differences and be curious. We're not all going to agree tonight, that's for sure, but we can be respectful and we can ask questions about what someone else shared. Can we learn more about why they think that? And perhaps that can inform your thinking on this subject. And be sure to let everyone participate. We don't want any 1 or 2 or 3 people to dominate the whole table. We have 8, 9, maybe more people in your group, Everyone needs an opportunity to provide their input because everyone's input is valuable to this process. And then lastly, your questions are valuable. I'm going to be available to float around the room to each table to answer your questions as they come up during this process so that we can help you hopefully provide informed input in our discussions tonight. So with that, I will let Elizabeth and the other facilitators get to their tables, and we will get underway. Just 1 second, Christine. Yeah. Just 1 second. There's no on. It's on.
Oh, we're going to do a little bit of room Jenga because we have 9 staff here able to facilitate, but we have 12 tables. So, if you don't mind, if you're at table 4, could 4 of you please scooch in with table 1? Could 3 of you please scooch in with table 8? Likewise, if you are at table 11, could some of you scooch in with table 9 and some of you scooch in with table 12? Thank you for helping out with that so we can hear all of you tonight. Again, table 4, please scoot in between table 1 and 5. Did I say that right? And table 11, please split between table 9 and 12. Yes. Thank you.
And so as you're getting situated, I do want to remind you that not all of the facilitators are from the planning department, and so be kind. They may not have all of the answers to your questions, but they are here to note your feedback. So if you do have specific questions, let your facilitator know, and I'll be around to hopefully answer those questions for you.
I haven't been able to figure this out. I noticed it last week. Is it an American Medicare here? Because you usually have 5.7 acres. At 30 per, you get 150. I'm not sure how you get 415.
So just a reminder, this is for the overall strategy. So this is just the one site. This isn't going to get you there. So the 30 is times the portion, but that's just the one site. So the overall strategy, this is all the sites we've identified in the existing general plan that are consistent with those
Like
communities.
a shopping mall.
Yeah, all of the housing and mixed use that we could yield new units. That's what that strategy encompasses.
We get together all not simplified. Our model is truth, duty, value.
Yeah.
And that sometimes gets me in a lot of trouble because sometimes I tell too much truth when I see words really close to my
Yeah.
in the military, you got to have that.
Yeah.
But my concern for this is that if you put housing on there, to replace the parking, you're going to have to grade parking, then you have to stack parking for the residents, then you have
Just because we at the table had a lot of concerns about what more housing means in Pacifica, and that's very painful. Thinking about the increase of traffic, thinking about potential loss of safety, the feel of what we love about Pacifica, that small town feel, losing some of our precious habitat and the animals that live there. With that said, for those who were in favor of some strategies, we looked at increasing housing density in the parts of town where that makes sense, and I have a list of sites here. What do you think, table? I think that's good. Some public sites, school-specific sites that I'll share with the planning team for sure. Yes, that's our summary.
Great. Thanks so much, Elizabeth, and
Yes.
the table in the back. Let's move
Sarah,
to the
would you
next
like
group.
to go next?
Thank you. I'm reporting out for table 8, and we had a discussion. We had a few people that needed to leave a little bit earlier, but our full table discussed wanting to get some more examples of the strategies and under the strategies in order to say whether they'd support those specific strategies or not. So kind of fleshing those out a little bit more. There were some sites in the examples where not everybody was really familiar with the site. For example, the Caltrans sites that were mentioned, but with a little bit more explanation. They seem to be pretty supportive of expanding the example in the Caltrans site in the Skyline area, because it was already easy access to transportation and the highway routes there. On the flip side of that, there was concern with increasing density and some of the examples being heavier in the northern area and Sharp Park areas, where there is already some lack of sidewalks and lack of infrastructure and streets to support an increased density of parking and traffic in the area, and also concerns with school drop-off and pickup in that area. So there were some concerns raised with the example of the public property site and looking at the Oceana High School site, with increasing the density of housing in that area that would possibly involve losing one of the drop-off or pickup spots and increasing traffic in that area. Other concerns that they shared were other infrastructure types of concerns, making sure that our sewer and wastewater systems can support the increased densities. The other concerns with densities that were brought up was looking at the particular neighborhoods and increasing densities where it makes sense, but not impacting negatively traffic and evacuation routes. So considering evacuation routes when looking at areas to increase density. There were concerns where, the adult kids are living at home because they can't because they can't afford to housing on their own. Some ideas of looking at some of the playing fields at schools to consider for possible housing sites and areas. And then also looking at areas such as the areas that were looking at for possible hotel development south of the Connemara site, north of the Pavilion of Flowers, possibly looking at the Siebel site for some housing as well, which was mentioned as part of the commercial development sites. Seem to be pretty supportive of housing and increasing heights where there is a commercial shopping center already, but some concerns with the impact of parking at those sites as well. And an overall need for more public transportation and increasing the frequency of bus schedules to alleviate some of the traffic concerns brought with additional housing.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, to you and your group. Let's go on to the next table. And for the facilitators, we don't need all of the specific sites. Make note. We'll take those later. Any high-level feedback, good or bad, on the strategies would be really helpful to keep us moving along.
Hi, we're table 9. I think we have some 11 people over here too, right? Former 11s. We accept you. Okay, so my notes are very, as usual, very scrambled and stuff, so I was trying to put some stuff down, and I think a lot of nods from the last two tables and some of the things they said that the folks agreed with. But we went into the first question, and we didn't really stick with all the questions and just kind of had a conversation, which was great. But we went from don't like any of the identified strategies to specifically with regards to Oceana, that what about the top lot of Oceana that's on the northern side? Why is that not being considered? And one of the reasons is because it turns out a lot of people from here live in that neighborhood. And they all ended up at the table here, and they were concerned about traffic coming down Paloma. It was one of those things, and there's already a road coming down from that parking lot. So it kind of started to make a lot more sense there. And then also, why not consider more coastal zone areas? And I think it sounds like the coastal zone is kind of like, well, we sort of have this limited thing, and it might be hard to do, but maybe that's a Band-Aid worth ripping off. And just because it might be hard, it should be something that we should explore, because we're kind of up against it with all these spaces and numbers and the percentages, and even if we get everything that's on here, we're not going to get everything, right? So we'll need some more areas. And then we kind of just talked about a lot of things. We were talking about strategies and what should and shouldn't be considered. And Lindemar Park and Ride was thrown out there, the old wastewater treatment plant site, which is also where council chambers are. What about the quarry? And about that time, Christian came over and answered about 10 questions from the group, which is very helpful. But we talked about, well, you would have to change the law to allow housing without having the vote at the quarry, and so what would that look like was a little bit of a topic here. And then the area behind the firehouse in Pedro Point, it's a Calson property, right? So that's private, so there's a lot of question about, well, the shopping centers and places like that are private, but what about other private areas? And would they fall in a different category, and how would you do that? And, church property was also mentioned. And then examples in some mixed usage, which I didn't know about, that they're going to be doing or have done at Lenardi's in Tanforan, and as examples were thrown out there. And then also maybe not looking at hillside, but maybe not only flatter places and some sloped areas, not quite getting up into the hillside. We could still protect our hillsides, but consider some other properties. And there was talk about the lumber yard that's on Highway 1 there, and there's a little slope behind there as a potential area. And then one comment was that schools that are in use should not be considered, and that the idea of having the housing on the school property with schools that are actually working was not something people were in favor, or some people were in favor for here. Big concern about traffic. I think a lot of people said that. Traffic, infrastructure. Someone very nicely said they were concerned about having enough city staff, so I felt that really. I'm sure everybody appreciates that very much. And then in general with the traffic too, also someone's just Lindemar in general. We got a lot of stuff going on there, and we don't need extra traffic down there. And in terms of the units per acre, everybody's a little skeptical, would like to see it. It depends on the site. If you want to go more, maybe, but we want to know where that's going to be at before we would say yes. And then again, more information about money for services too, and the capacity. Can our schools have it? We had an insider from the district at our table, and it sounds like there's capacity in the school, but how many kids are going to come in with that? And let's see, the one last thing, I think we at least came up with a little bit of a slogan for our community values: small town feel and keep the nature. So.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Oh, good. All right.
We'll travel. Go ahead and stay there, Anthony.
Oh, thank you. I'll come up there. So I'm going to go back to the circle. Thank you. Good evening, folks. Anthony Shriver reporting back to you all for group number 5. So a lot of great discussion, a lot of similar themes amongst our group as well. And some of the identified strategies, A through F, were the Park Mall Shopping Center was identified, along with the Seabowl shopping area too, our group discussed, and the quarry too, and if that would be a proposed site and what that might look like. And then moving on to other locations where, let's see, where the Corp Yard as well too, they were in favor of that, and then some discussion around Park Mall and how that was unused, and then building along hillsides too, and possibly Oddstad. And there was some discussion around the school sites as well too, and how that would be a good location. And then church sites too. I think that was brought up earlier in the discussion as well. And then someone had mentioned the rifle range too as a proposed location. We moved on to number 2 as far as any other strategies that should be considered. And this was some interesting discussion. Of course, high-rise buildings and high-rise apartments along the hillsides, but there was some discussion as far as building on top of the freeways too. And so that was an interesting point, and Albany was an example that was discussed in our group. And number 3, should the city eliminate any of the identified strategies? One of them was the coastal zone. The group number 5 was in favor of preserving the coast and not developing there. Other ones were private properties as well too, and if those could be identified. And then just building up in general, as far as instead of spreading it out, but just building on top of like 3 or 4 level buildings. And then that was pretty much a lot of the discussion. Some discussion around rezoning too, and a lot of discussion around, like I was saying, building up in sky homes. And then the last point was, are there any specific sites you believe should be considered? And we discussed the quarry. And so that was the main talking points with our group.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Alyssa?
And Elizabeth, can you bring the microphone around? We don't need everyone.
Yeah, I was trying.
Thanks.
Coming to you, Alyssa. Oh, here, dear.
Thank you. So I'm reporting from Table 6. We had an overall great discussion. We discussed support of development in general, private property development, housing units near Highway 1 for transportation purposes, and mixed-use housing. We discussed concerns regarding the Oceana site due to traffic constraints, and it's already pretty busy as it is. Planning constraints when developing private properties, potentially having a review process for ADUs per street due to traffic and parking constraints. We discussed increasing density in shopping centers and Seabowl, and also to consider the query. Focus on development in areas that can ease transportation and traffic constraints, and finally identify more areas on the coast that can be developed.
Great. Thanks, Alyssa.
Gwen?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Gwen, and I had the pleasure of speaking with table number 10. And so most of what everyone else has covered, that's the same thing that we covered. So I'm going to give you just a really, really quick overview so that we can move on to the next tables. For number 1, they felt that all the areas were good, with the exception of Oceana. Oceana came up numerous times at this table regarding the fact of all the things that everyone else has brought up. The traffic, the schools, the parking, everything else. The second one, they felt that the area in Lindemar next to the gas station should be considered. Number 3, yes. Number 3, should the city eliminate any identified strategies? Again, Oceana field. However, they did mention the top part of Oceana with a good consideration. For number 4, they felt that the city should try to purchase privately owned property, and they also felt that the area located by Safeway in the Lindemar Shopping Center was a good location. For number 5, it was brought up that the area of 2212 Beach is an ideal location. 2212 Beach, is that next?
That's the old wastewater treatment plant in West Sharp Park.
Okay. And for number 6, they felt that we should take under consideration the fires that currently happen in the Oceana Hills. So another thing I want to bring up that the table discussed was when we talk about more housing, we talk about more people and individuals, or families and individuals moving to Pacifica and the cost of rent. And there was a lot of concern as to what the city would do to make rent more affordable for the area. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Gwen.
Oh, Ray.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Raymond Donginis, Public Works. So I had the pleasure of sitting with Table 2, and basically we talked about pretty much what everybody's talked about as well. With all the ideas that was presented tonight, I think our table was pretty open to all of them, because we felt that we probably will need all of them to get our numbers. But some agree with definitely with ADU, with the shopping, and with the Caltrans sites. I think to increase density in suitable areas, our group was open to taller buildings, five stories, to get our numbers. Other areas that was brought up are, the SF properties, rifle range, that area behind Shaw Park Road. Church properties was also brought up. And also, the biggest concerns was also the safety with all the increase in the density and the housing, egress from the back of the valley, increasing, the infrastructure, and increasing due to the increase of traffic, we're concerned about getting out of the valley and traffic in Highway 1.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Raymond.
Good evening. I had table 3 and 7. We started off our conversation just kind of having initial reactions to the tasks that we've been asked to talk about tonight. And what I heard was just general concerns about impacts on parking, traffic, our infrastructure, our emergency services, and impacts on recreational facilities that we have as a result of this increased housing. As we started going through the questions, I heard support for ADUs. I heard support for densifying housing in the shopping centers and adding height to these areas. I heard support for public properties with the very clear exception of Oceana High School. I heard support for the Caltrans properties. I heard support for the development of the coastal zone, support of protecting coastal housing. When we were discussing new strategies, an idea of adding housing to our self-storage facility properties, allowing that type of use to include housing. I heard densifying the Harmony at 1 subdivision, and developing the quarry. Strategies to be removed was clearly Oceana. And the table was able to create a list of sites that they would be supportive of adding density to. And in terms of values, just as further support of protecting our greenways, our open space, for our community. So,
Terrific. Thank you, Bonnie. And I think we have our last table. Save the best for last, right, Yulia?
Yeah, last but not least. So our group was very dynamic, very educated, and I just want to compliment everyone who contributed to discussion. So it was really great. So for question number 1, so all strategies make sense. So the group was unanimous on that. C, shopping centers and commercial. So people expressed some concerns to make sure that the retail will still in place. Do I have an echo? Sorry, I can't hear myself. The public property side, so again, as many others already identified, so Oceana School raised some concerns about school traffic, but overall, one of the comments was that to make sure that all the development is consistent throughout the city, so it's not just one or two sites. Question number 2 for the additional strategies. The group wanted to look closer at Eureka Square, old sewer plant, Palmetto site, specifically site designated for the hotel development. And one of the comments was to add the second level along Palmetto and Francisca to increase density. And there was a very good discussion about the policy around the affordable housing and funding strategies and affordability. Question number 4, the group wanted to see the fuller site of potential sites, so it wanted to do, for the city to do some additional work. And the second part of the question about the density, we had some split of opinions here, so yes, it may be suitable depending on the site. High density around commercial sites already developed, so kind of makes sense. So there was some concern expressed on not being able to accommodate the additional density, again, traffic and other issues. And again, maybe it makes sense along the highway, but not in every way across the city. So question number 5, for additional specific sites that should or should not be considered. For should, we identified Artstead School, Lindemar School, and well, there was some discussion about housing for teachers, police officers, firefighters, and there was some other sites. So again, I have my notes. And for not to consider was again Oceana High School, again due to the same reasons everyone identified: traffic, accessibility, and overall school capacity. And for the values, again, there was some discussion about schools and capacity to accommodate increased population. And another value to consider, just to make sure that we develop different types of housing, including transitional housing and others. So that's the report from our group.
Great, thank you, Yulia. And thank you to everybody, all the groups, all the facilitators. So much insightful feedback tonight. I'm so grateful that you all came, and for those of you that stuck around to the very end. We did go over, but it's such an important discussion for our community, and so I was willing to give the extra time, and I see that you all were too, so thank you. Before we get into the next steps, one more request, a plug, please complete the surveys, leave them on the table before you go out. The next steps for our process, we are going to take all this information in, analyze it, try to pull out the key insights from our community as to the strategies we've identified, see if we need to refine our approach, and then really get down to the number crunching and the site identification to see if we can make our arena and what steps it will take, in order to help us achieve that. We are going to put out that list of all of the sites that you've all been wanting to see, most likely as part of our draft housing element document in January. If there's an opportunity to release it sooner, we will, but there's just so much work to be done between now and then. I don't want to commit to you that we'll be able to give it to you for review sooner than the draft housing element early next year. We are going to continue our work beyond sites on the other parts of the housing element. Some of the commenters tonight mentioned, well, aren't there a bunch of policies and programs and other things you need to look at? Yes, absolutely there is. The housing element update process is extensive, it's expansive, and it's a very comprehensive process. Tonight was just one piece of that in terms of strategies for sites. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to release a draft document that addresses all of those points to our best ability based on your feedback that we've received tonight, at last week's meeting, and at all the other community engagement we've done for the housing element and our prior planning activities, and put out that document, and you'll let us know, did we get it right or not early next year. So I want to say thank you on behalf of the city, on behalf of all the city staff. Again, we're so grateful for you taking the time. We know it's hard to get out to these community meetings. Please let us know how we did, or if additional thoughts or feedback come to mind. You can email us at housing@pacifica.gov. You can go to planpacifica.org, which is our project website. If you're not already on our mailing list for the housing element, we strongly encourage you to sign up so you can get word of additional public input opportunities, when the draft document's been released, and so on. You can text Pacifica Housing to 22828, or you can hold your phone up to the QR code that's on any of these screens before you go, and your phone will take you to the website in order to sign up. With that, please get home safely, please leave your surveys, and thank you all again so much for coming tonight.